Hey guys, so second part of the second part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, on those who are sublime, and talking about those who are sublime. I think possibly this is he's talking about priests. He says they're too solemn and serious. And the quote I've got is, "He has not learned laughter or beauty. Gloomy this hunter returned from the woods of knowledge." So against that seriousness. It may sound kind of funny, but Nietzsche is all about gaiety, lightness, carefreeness, and he doesn't like people who are overly serious. He thinks life is supposed to be exuberant and joyful, and priests are not for Nietzsche. He also talks about the physical, again, preaching the physical or the mortal over the afterworldly and the imaginary. And the quote I have there is, "His happiness should smell of the earth and not contempt for the earth." Again, a common criticism of Christianity, especially earlier, prior to modernity, right? It's not so much the case now, but I think prior to modern times, Christianity was definitely discounted, at the very least, discounted the earthly in relation to heaven and the afterworld. And yeah, so Nietzsche's not up for that. He remarks that the sublime has not overcome his deed. So, remembering that all life is characterized by the will to power, even in the self, there must be a self-overcoming. To live in harmony with this will, we must therefore continually strive, move forwards, progress, creating and recreating ourselves in each moment. And the sublime person hasn't overcome themselves like this. That because they've stagnated, they've fixed, their outlook has become fixed, and there's no more movement anymore. The values are all absolute. There's no more progression in their outlook. Okay, so the next part, on the land of education. Basically, this is just a criticism of modern education. And Nietzsche thought people these days merely regurgitate what people had thought in the past, and at the most they kind of paint over what was there with something more or less the same. So I took this as an attack against the lack of originality and authenticity in thinking. So people just, as I said, regurgitating what people had already thought. That's pretty much that. And the next section was on immaculate perception. And this is kind of interesting. He attacks basically detachment here. So he slams the people he calls immaculate perceivers. And they're the ones who they try and perceive kind of objectively. So immaculate perceiving is like seeing without kind of being caught up in what you're seeing. So like looking at something from a distance, perceiving from a distance. And he says those kind of people who look like that, they're looking at life without desire, with a dead will. So there must surely be a reference to Schopenhauer there again. And the quote I've got is, "To look at life without desire and not like a dog with my tongue hanging out. To be happy in looking with a will that has died and without the grasping and greed of selfishness." So he wants, when we look, when we engage, when we perceive, we ought to be engaged. We ought to be have an interest in what's going on. We shouldn't be removed from something, from the world around us. We should be actively engaged in and with it. He also calls these people, these immaculate perceivers, sentimental hypocrites. And that's because they love the earth, actually, and the earthly, but they're ashamed of it. And so there's a what he calls a bad conscience here. And he says, your spirit has been persuaded to despise the earthly, but your entrails have not been persuaded, and they are what is strongest in you. So kind of they know, or they think that they ought not to love the earth, to be passionate, to have these desires that they have, but they can't help it anyway, and so they have this bad conscience. And then because they renounce their own desires, they must make all desire bad, and that's where we get to with some of the Christian doctrine of old, right? The metaphor he uses in this passage is he calls the immaculate perceivers the moon, or like the moon, which slips stealthily over rooftops, silently and piously peering from a distance. And this represents kind of the ultimate dishonest attitude for Nietzsche. He prefers that innocent, overt acceptance of and embracing of desire. For example, the opposite of the moon, the sun, which doesn't kind of slink about, but grandly announces itself and honestly and openly expresses its love for the earth below. The next part is on scholars, and basically this is an attack on academic scholars for seeking knowledge at their desks and in their books rather than living life. He says they pursue knowledge without any will or passion, and they're basically gaping at the thoughts of others like spectators. Mechanical drones always lying in wait, ready to attack. People like Nietzsche. So this, I thought, was a personal and quite bitter passage, where he admits that he, quote, lived with them, but that because he, quote, lived above them, they developed a grudge against him. And he says, so far I've been heard least well by the most scholarly. So yeah, there's that's quite, like I say, personal. I think Nietzsche's talking about his relationships with other academics, and he wasn't well received in those circles. The next part is on poets, where he attacks poets for being superficial and claims that they will muddy their waters to make them appear deep. And on top of this, he says they're vain, and I'll read the quote to you, always fancy that nature herself is in love with them, and that she is creeping to their ears to tell them secrets and amorous flatteries. And of this they brag and boast before all mortals. In addition, they crave spectators. They're like those actors in the marketplace. They want fame and fortune and adorers. I did think this was kind of ironic, though, this passage, because when I read what I'd written here, I thought this sounds exactly like Nietzsche, almost, you know. A lot of his writing is poetic, actually, and it's full of metaphor and allusion and imagery, which one could easily claim is muddying the waters. And vain, just read Ecce Homo. That is like, I don't think I've ever read anything where someone boasts about themselves more than Nietzsche does in that book. So I don't know. I did think that was a little bit on the nose. I usually try and defend the guys I talk about, the people I talk about, but yeah, I did feel like that seems to be a little bit contradictory, criticizing poets, when basically that to me describes Nietzsche perfectly. So anyway, let's move on. On great events is the next section, and the central metaphor here is an island with a fire-spewing mountain which smokes continuously. And this is a metaphor for so-called great events, which are accompanied by much bellowing and smoke. And Nietzsche disagrees with that. He says that great events are not our loudest, but our stillest hours. And it's not around the inventors of new noise, but around the inventors of new values that the world revolves. He says it revolves inaudibly. So those who attempt to promote themselves, have a lot of fanfare. Again, we're back to this idea of the actors in the marketplace of the flies. And when they do try to overthrow old statues, with all their noise and hullabaloo, all they do is make the overthrow more popular and godlike through its suffering. So yeah, it's all about a kind of inner strength and kind of not having to make a big fanfare and a big show about your ideas. And he sees the state in the same light. The state likes to talk with smoke and bellowing, basically to make itself believe that it has the truth, and that it's telling the truth, telling things like it is. But it's the opposite that's true, really. So the next part was the soothsayer, and here there's a soothsayer comes along and talks about a great weariness and sadness that has descended on mankind. All is empty, all is the same, all has been. So that strikes me there could be, it's just like a very negative, pessimistic kind of attitude. And Zarathustra's kind of caught up in this and lapses into melancholy. And then after 3 days of not eating or sleeping, he finally sleeps and dreams. And when he dreams, in his dream, he turned his back on life and was a, quote, a night watchman and a guardian of tombs upon the lonely mountain castle of death. Poetry? Anyway, you can think of it. So, eventually, a roaring wind bursts into the castle and tears a black coffin open, and from out of the coffin, quoting again, spewed out 1,000-fold laughter, and from 1,000-fold grimaces of children, angels, owls, fools, and butterflies as big as children, it laughed and mocked and roared at me. Then he wakes up, and one of his disciples interprets the dream, saying that Zarathustra is like that wind, blowing through all death chambers and gloominess, and the serious people with their serious attitude, and frightening and laughing at those people who have that serious, somber nature. So I took it as being basically a parable praising joy, laughter, and levity. So that's the soothsayer. Then we have the next part on redemption. And this, I've got quite a bit to talk about with this one. Zarathustra next comes across a group of disabled people and beggars, all afflicted with some incurable ailment. And they ask to be healed, but Zarathustra says he won't do it, because healing them wouldn't help them. So we're back to that idea of kind of pity and although there is more to this. So he says, yeah, healing them's not helpful. And he talks about a bigger problem than these guys, which is what he calls inverse cripples. And these are people who lack everything except for one thing which they have too much of. And some examples include people who are nothing but a big eye, or a big mouth, or a big belly. They just have one thing, and they have a lot of it, too much of it. And people tend to think that these inverse cripples are great men, even geniuses, but Zarathustra disagrees. So this was a little bit odd to read, and but I thought maybe he's talking of these inverse cripples. He's talking about people who live kind of narrow lives, focusing on one thing to the exclusion of everything else. And so people tend to think or come to believe that these people are experts, geniuses, when in fact they're not, because they only know this one aspect. They're kind of one-dimensional. There's no substance to them beyond that one thing. And then he moves on to talk about redemption, which is the main point of this passage. Redemption is an attempt to change the past, to recreate all it was into a "thus I willed it." So for Nietzsche, redemption is taking what it's not revenge, it's not getting back, or it's not changing anything, because the past can't be changed. It's about re-perceiving, maybe, or reworking what happened, so that it's no longer just it was, so that it is instead a "thus I willed it." So it's kind of taking control over what happened and owning it. I think owning what happened in the past, and it's that is redemption. So I'll just keep going with some of the things I've got here. Willing liberates, but even the will can be chained by "it was," by the past. And because it's powerless, right? The will is powerless against what's already done. It's powerless against the past. And so I think the idea here is that the people with disabilities were metaphors for people suffering with their own past. So we have this situation then where the suffering that the will is put through in the face of its unalterable past, because of that, willing itself and life and existence came to be seen as a punishment, right? Because you have this past, this "it was," that is, there's nothing you can do about it. It's fixed. Things that happen, and you can't change them. You can't fix them. So life itself, existence itself, came to be seen as a punishment. And this, what we could call an existential condition, this tragic "it was" that can't be fixed, can't be healed, keeping with the metaphor of the disabled people, then this punishment of existence, of life, must therefore be eternal. There's no way to get around it. There's no way to alleviate it. And so I've got a quote here. "This is what is eternal in the punishment called existence, that existence must eternally become deed and guilt again." So no matter what you do, just by existing, you automatically get caught up in this this tragic existential condition whereby things that you do, the things that happen to you, they will become unalterable, and you won't be able to do anything about it. You can't get redemption from them. And so the only way people thought they could overcome this existential condition, this tragedy of the "it was," and thereby attain redemption, was therefore to stop willing entirely. If willing should become not willing. and this is where we get to the denial of life that Nietzsche thought characterized a lot of philosophy and thought and religion at the time, including Schopenhauer. I guess he must have been at the top of the list in terms of people who Nietzsche was criticizing here. But he says, so this is all a mistake. This is all wrong. The only way to claim redemption is by fiat, for the creative will to just assert that all of it was actually a thus I willed it, is to just take control and not try and change anything, just accept that that's the way it was, and joyfully, exuberantly embrace it and move forward from there. And that's the only way, he says, we can redeem ourselves. No one, including ourselves and including anybody claiming to be the Son of God, can heal us of these of our pasts. So that's kind of an important passage, and good to look at that in some detail on redemption. Then we look at on human prudence, and basically we'll just run through this quite quickly. He recounts 4 instances of his prudence, he says, when it comes to humans. First, he says that it's better to be deceived occasionally than to be on guard and cautious all the time. So the quote I have is, if I were on guard against men, how could men then be an anchor for my ball? I should be swept up and away too easily. So I thought what he's saying here is that what Zarathustra is saying is that he wants to help humanity and share his wisdom with us, but he can't do that and at the same time be removed from them, and distance himself from us. Secondly, he spares the vain more than the proud. So the reason for this is that the vain are insecure and they need praise, and without this they would be broken. So he's not out to destroy the weak already. The proud, however, they are, if they are hurt or criticized, because of their strength, their inner strength, they will likely grow into something stronger and better. So he's saying he doesn't handle with kid gloves the proud, but he will do that with the vain, because they're not strong enough to handle reality. Third, he doesn't allow the sight of evil to be diminished for him by modern people's timidity. And what I think he's talking about here is what is typically considered evil is necessary and important, because it's only by facing great evil that people can become great. And the quote there in support of that is, in order that the overman should not lack his dragon, there must arise the over-dragon that is worthy of him. So there must be, it's just that old idea, I think we've talked about it before, you need challenges, suffering, obstacles to face in order to become great, noble. And his final instance of prudence is that he prefers to look upon modern men and women in disguise. He says, well decked out and vain and dignified as the good and the just. And this is because he says that modern folks have no substance underneath, and it disturbs him to see them naked. Okay, so kind of he didn't like most people, really. He didn't like most of his contemporaries. And the final passage in this part, the second part, is called the stillest hour. And here Zarathustra has a conversation with a voice in his mind in which he confesses that he's become unsure of himself. So he says here that he lacks the lion's voice for commanding. And the voice tells him he's still a proud youth, but he must become a child. And remembering that the three metamorphoses from the first part, the camel, the lion, and the child. The child is the creator. So his inner voice is telling him he must become a child. Zarathustra says he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want the burden. And finally, in this section, he leaves his friends to return to his mountain once more. And we'll pick it up from there in the third part next time. So yeah, so that's that. I hope this is helping. I'm going through them in quite a bit of detail, and maybe I'm repeating myself a lot, but I'm actually finding the doing these really helpful for my own understanding. I feel like I'm getting a much richer understanding of Nietzsche in talking about him so much, way too much, hey, really. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.